Salutations, ladies and gentlemen, the Knife Raven here, back again with another video, and in today's video, I was hoping to sit down and record something a little bit more positive. For example, a review of a new knife. But I decided in the last couple days something happened that meant that my next video was not going to be directed towards the original subject, but rather the new subject that has arisen. Now, I have spoken about this before, but this is the first time I'm dedicating an entire video to it. Well, I, as some of you may know, have suffered from a bit of a problem, and I feel like a bit is putting it quite lightly, where back springs on certain knives tend to, well, to put it simply, not do very well under normal use. And these back springs have become quite the problem. Now, this is the first instance of this. This was a left-handed lamb foot by A. Wright. This is, of course, the piece of the spring that snapped. And you're wondering why I've kept this knife, because it's obviously not useful to do much of anything. I don't ever carry it, obviously. But I keep it as a reminder of what not to do in terms of a traditional knife. I got a replacement a while back. It was this. And as you can probably already see, same thing, in the exact same spot, the thinnest part of the spring in the center of the knife. Same issue. Then I had an ebony right-handed lamb foot that I unfortunately don't have to show you because that one was sent back to the retailer for a refund. But I do have pictures of it up on my YouTube channel community page, so if you don't believe me, go check and you will find an ebony example of the lamb foot knife, and that one also had a broken spring. Then we have this, an Arthur Wright Barlow, a knife I very much enjoyed. And here again, we have a broken spring. Now, you're probably thinking that well, if you're being reasonable about it, you'd think probably one of two things. One, there is a severe structural problem with these knives in terms of their design, machining parts, something or other, and it's causing this problem to occur, well, more than it should, which is never. Or I abuse my knives in some way that makes this possible. Well, to clear up that, I don't put my knives through any real abuse. I will occasionally carry a certain knife, for example, the Arthur Wright knives I do like carrying, this one being a good example. And yes, I open and close the knife quite a bit, as I just find knives enjoyable as a whole, and I like, well, opening and closing them. I find it to be a nice fidget factor. However, knives are meant to be opened and closed thousands of times during their usable life. And typically you don't see this happening. Forget a knife that has been owned for around a year or so. In this case, not even a year. So, what's the topic of discussion today? Well, those 4 knives I just showed you, well, 3 plus the one that I don't have, unfortunately, on hand. Today, we have this. This is the Arthur Wright Peach Pruner in Buffalo. This was a knife I spoke very highly of. I really like this knife. And just the other day, it decided to give up on existing and snap just like the rest. And this is a bit of an anomaly. And I would like to talk about this because this was asked, and I feel it to be quite pertinent at the moment to bring up. If you buy an Arthur Wright knife and you're worried about the spring breaking, is it just going to fall out when it breaks and drop on the ground? Or is it going to launch itself across the room? This was a comment that I remember receiving. To answer that, this first knife, the very first one that broke, when it snapped, it flew a few feet away and almost hit my mother. So at least a good 4 feet of distance to the right. This one, I was sitting down at the time, and this one snapped and managed to dodge my eye, and it flew about 4 feet or so back behind me. The Michael May, which is one that I haven't yet discussed in this particular video, this is mostly a problem with Arthur Wright knives, as this is the brand we're discussing here. There was one instance where a Michael May knife did the same. And the reason I can't show that is Michael took the knife and put in a new back spring. Now, while I will still caution you in terms of the chance of having a breaking back spring on a Michael May knife is certainly there, out of the 7 Michael May knives I have, only one instance of this has occurred. With Arthur Wright, this has happened now 5 times. But yes, so this one, which I believe was the first. Was this the first, or was this the first? All right, this one was the one that nearly hit my mother. This one nearly hit me. The lamb foot flew to the side and actually took a chip out of another knife. The Barlow, this one, just hit my hand because it was in the way. But the Peach Pruner is particularly special. Why? Well, this knife, when I was closing it, and this typically occurs when you're closing the knife, not opening it. So you're pushing down on the blade, putting tension on the spring at this very clearly weak spot, and the spring broke. And I remember where it landed and exactly where I was standing. So out of curiosity, I decided to measure the distance that it traveled. Got a measuring tape out, and while not exact, I'm sure, the knife flew up because it was being closed like this. So it was angled a bit up, and it went towards the ceiling, which is 8 feet above the ground. Now, when it broke, the back spring hit the ceiling 8 feet above the ground, and then it proceeded to ricochet back down and roll across the floor a little. All in all, I'd say it probably traveled a total distance, if you count the direction alone, it probably moved about 10 or so feet. But the fact that in its initial leap upward, it managed to reach 8 feet in terms of altitude before getting stopped by the ceiling is extraordinarily concerning, as I'm sure you already can probably tell for yourself. Now, this sounds very cartoonish now, doesn't it? A spring breaking and flying with enough speed that it could probably injure someone if it hit them. And while, yes, it does sound cartoonish, it's also very much real. I have no reason to lie about this, as this has happened many, many times, and each instance you can see here for yourself. And this is something I've dealt with before, and something that, if given the current track record, I might deal with again. So, this video serves multiple purposes. One, it's a bit of a rant for my own personal wish. This has been something that has bothered me for quite some time, and something that is proving to be quite the deterrent in terms of purchasing more of these knives. And I must say, it had been a decent gap since the last instance. This knife broke around 8 months ago, maybe a little bit longer, but it was coming on a year. This broke, I believe, 2 or 3 days ago. And it had been a while since it had happened, and I was starting to become optimistic. But, unfortunately, no. Just like the rest, it had to break. Now, a few things. First of all, this is not me saying that all Arthur Wright knives are terrible, don't go near them. As I have owned knives, for example, this is a recent model, made, I believe, late 2023, early 2024, and the spring on this is authoritative, but not dangerously so. If I had to rank it, I'd say it's a good 7, maybe an 8 on the poll. All of these were probably closer to a 9 or a 10. This was a 10. This was about a 9. This was easily a 9. And this was probably around an 8. So definitely this is a bit lighter, probably closer to 7. And because of that, I'm a little bit optimistic about it, as with a few others. Now compare it to something like this, a Groman Slimline. This is a 4. Now this knife is so light, I'm almost concerned about using it, because you could make the argument that the spring isn't strong enough to hold the blade open. But I'd certainly rather have a knife that is lighter on the spring, but won't possibly take an eye out. And I don't think that will ever happen with this knife. Who knows? I could be testing fate, I might be wrong, but generally a knife with a more friendly back spring seems a bit more resilient to this. And the reason that I have guessed that this is all about is because you have a carbon spring that is too hard, and when you have something that's hard, you risk it becoming brittle. And when it becomes brittle, you put it under a large degree of stress, simply just opening and closing the knife, which is what it's supposed to do. That spring, in its brittle state, will break. Compare that with a spring that's far too soft. This was a Rough Rider, and you can see there's a bend in that spring. And that's because this spring is so soft, you can actually sort of bend it yourself. And so too much use caused it to bend, and now you have an incredibly weak main blade, as well as a very much useless secondary blade. And so these are both terrible instances. But giving the Rough Rider credit, this has happened once. This has happened 5 times, plus the one Michael May. So, I didn't really have a direction when I started this video. I have talked about this before. I've said that it's something that I'm hoping to, well, no longer have to talk about, because the problem will be remedied eventually. That's the hope. But I must admit, I am a little bit irritated. For one, because this has happened again, after enough time to start becoming optimistic, which has certainly ruined that outlook now. But also because this knife, I directly contacted Mr. Michael Harrison about. Or rather, I contacted him about the ebony model to inform him of the issue. And in the midst of our correspondence, this knife broke, and I gave him the update that this had happened yet again, making it 4 at this point. And he offered to send me a replacement knife free of charge, and I believe that was back in September or August of last year. And I haven't received a replacement Barlow. Now, understandably, I know they're a very small company. They have few staff, and probably have been dealing with massive increase in demand as Arthur Wright knives have become more mainstream in the traditional community. Various YouTube channels with good followings have been discussing them. You have Baxter's Blades, Steel City Knives, Slick Slicers, Patty's Potato Peelers, a whole bunch of wonderful channels that have been showcasing these knives and increasing their popularity. Now, a large demand and a great deal of production is understandable, and I will be forgiving in that regard, but it is nearing a year since this happened and there was supposed to be a replacement, and I have not heard since. So as a bit of a reminder, and also because I am thoroughly fed up with this, I'm going to be sending another email, and hopefully this one will be received with a little bit more, well, customer service. And usually I'm not this much of a, well, I don't complain this much. But to put it simply, this has happened 5 times. I have a bit of a right to be significantly irritated. So once again, this is this is meaning no ill will towards Arthur Wright as a firm, to the makers themselves, but I do think that there is a severe problem in terms of production. And I'm no knife maker, but seeing that all of these knives have broken in the exact same spot, with the same springs in terms of the steel that they use, something has to change, because as you can see, there's this one part of the spring that's thinner than the rest, and this is the part that keeps breaking. I don't know what the solution is. Perhaps pay more attention to heat treatment, add a thicker, tougher back spring, or just, and this is something that I have been suggesting for a while anyway, make the pulls less tight. Because there are many people who can't even open a knife like this. I have handed these knives to people before, and they have to hand them back to me to get them opened. So I understand the love of a strong pull, but this is absolutely ridiculous. So there's my rant for you today. I'm sorry I couldn't have been a bit more pleasant and complimentary. I really wish I could. Again, this might be me just whining unnecessarily, and if that's the case, by all means, inform me of such. But, again, I felt a need to bring this forward, as I have been an advocate for Arthur Wright knives myself. And while I wouldn't put my channel in the same league as the others that I've mentioned in terms of influence or professionality, it doesn't change the fact that I recommend these knives to people. I suggest them, and because of that, I have heard that many people have bought them because of me. And so, as someone who recommends these products, I feel a need to ensure that what I'm recommending is actually worth their money. And I regretfully say that now, after this instance again, it's reminded me that perhaps now I can't recommend them as fully as I did before. And I've always made comments about it and always tried to downplay them because I want Arthur Wright to succeed. I want the small businesses in Sheffield and France and Italy and all the other cutlery centers of the world. I want them to be successful again. And I want them to gain the esteem that they deserve. However, I still think I can't, on good conscience, suggest to people that they purchase a knife that I myself don't have much faith in anymore. So, there we are. There's my unfortunate news update in terms of these knives, and again, unless otherwise directed by Mr. Michael Harrison if he gets back to me, I'm going to keep these, as once again, I like to have them as a reminder of what not to do in terms of knife making and what to be careful of. And also because this issue is apparently so uncommon to most people, they didn't believe that this could happen. And so if for nothing else, it's to prove that I'm not making things up, and I actually do have a problem with these knives, and that it is very much a problem worth considering looking into. So, there you are, as I cart away the 4 corpses of these once loved knives. I suppose that's that. I don't think I'll be buying another Arthur Wright knife until I at very least get a response from Mr. Harrison, and hopefully some reassurance that this can change. And the one thing I will say, and this is again trying to be as fair and genuine as I possibly can, this knife I did purchase last year, middle of the year, middle to late. And so for that reason, this might have still been part of one of the batches with very overtight springs. As again, the more recent batches have seemed a lot better in that regard. I am hoping that they are improving and lessening the pull of the springs. But if one of these breaks that has been purchased in the last 6 months or so, I'm starting to think that they haven't learned anything, and the loosening of the springs is probably not going to be enough if they ever do it in the first place. But whether it's a combination of the tempering, heat treatment, the type of steel they're using, how thin they cut it, or just, as I'm theorizing, a combination of all of the above, with the most important part being the spring tension. These knives are flawed, severely and deeply so. I can forgive little gaps and raised pins, slightly offset blades and the like, but this has reached the point where it's no longer just a severe annoyance if this happens. A spring that launched with enough trajectory to reach 8 feet up into the air is not safe for use. I don't think that I could, in good faith, recommend these for use now. If that chance, small as it may be, that the spring breaks on you, if it's faced in the wrong direction, you could lose a priceless vase or a window, or perhaps even your eye. So this has reached a point where it's now dangerous, and I know, as strange as it seems, that seems like an exaggeration. I assure you it isn't. And I say that on my honor as a reviewer. So, there we are. I leave you off on an unfortunately bleak note, but I suppose the best I can hope for is that Mr. Harrison seriously considers this, finds some way to remedy the problem, and maybe in the future, well, I hope every time this happens that it's the last time it ever will. So here's hoping that this Peach Pruner will be the last victim of this problem, and that from now on, that won't occur. So thank you very much for watching. Again, I regret sending you off on this note, but I feel like I need to say this, as even more than my Ettrick video, this is a very serious problem, and one that I think needs to be discussed. So thank you very much for watching. This has been, I don't know what the title of this video is going to be, but perhaps The Tragedy of the Backspring. And this is the Knife Raven, as always, signing off. Goodbye.